How do you turn an old 6-story office building into 58 housing units? It is not easy, but it is doable, as proven by our next guest this evening. Karin Liljegren is the founder of a company called Omgivning. They rehab unoccupied spaces and they turn them into all sorts of other things, including housing. It's a concept known as adaptive reuse. And when I caught up with her earlier, she started by sharing a couple of examples.
A lot of it stemmed from the historic core in downtown LA. Back in 1999, there was a new city ordinance which really incentivized the development of these buildings, and they were almost totally empty. And so I got involved with that in 99, and then I started my firm in 2009, and we've been kind of focusing on adaptive reuse. So a lot of those buildings in the early days all became residential apartments. But now we do conversion to hotels, conversion to office, conversion to residential. And obviously residential is much more of the hot thing right now.
And let's talk a little bit specifically about the residential. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of pros to doing this, right? There's buildings that are abandoned or not being used. It's a lot of space. But what does it technically take to turn, there's a reason why an office building is an office building and not a home. So what does it take to do that? And are there certain buildings that are better or worse for adaptive reuse?
Well, the process is usually, every building is different, which is why it's so hard to kind of generalize. But typically, you will likely need to put in all new building systems like mechanical, electrical, plumbing. You have to do seismic retrofit, like new structural work. A lot of the building goes down and gets gutted. So it's like the structure and the windows and if there's any historic fabric or cool things that are still in the building, you try to save all those things. But then everything else is usually pretty new. So in terms of types of buildings, again, every building's different, but probably the easiest ones are ones that are a little bit more skinny, so they have more light and ventilation, so it's easier to convert to housing. But there's a lot of things you can do to create housing in buildings that you wouldn't necessarily think.
Oh, you've teed me up so perfectly, because I really wanted to ask you about this, about the old Sears building in Boyle Heights. And I was reading about, that's a chalky kind of building there. And of course, when people are living somewhere, they want to have access to light. And it sounds like you came up with a really interesting workaround on that. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, well, so the program was to put in over 1,000 apartments into that building, plus about 200,000 square feet of office and 60,000 square feet of retail. So with that program and a building that's that chunky, like you said, you really have to carve into the building and create these big light courts. So that's a big part of how that design came around. And also with a building that big, to carve into it allows ways to kind of interconnect within the building. So if you're on the ground floor in a food hall, now there's a big cut through the building, and you can kind of experience that there's a bunch of residential above you and maybe seeing people walking on paths and things like that.
There's a green element to all of this, the argument being, it's much better to reduce, reuse, recycle than tear down buildings and start up again. How much can you save, do you feel like? How much is this a benefit to the planet?
Oh, it's a huge benefit. Well, and also just going back to when this big wave was starting, especially in Los Angeles in '99, back then the narrative was always about revitalization. It was about revitalizing the city. And now I think we saw what that could do. And now the conversation is really about sustainability, reuse, and the housing crisis, right? So in terms of what you can save, it can take up to 80 years for a brand new, totally energy efficient building just to overcome the negative climate impact created during construction. So take 80 years just to overcome the construction. So that's huge. And there's a lot of other stats, not that I can remember them all off the top of my head.
No, but that's huge. I want to ask you, Karin, because you've been doing this for a really long time, and then all of a sudden COVID comes along, almost everybody goes home. A lot of people have gone back to work, but a lot of people realize, nope, I'm never going back to an office again. How do you foresee the pandemic experience shaping the future of adaptive reuse?
So the vacancies they've been rising, but they're only going to rise even more because a lot of companies didn't reduce or remove themselves from their spaces because they had these long leases, right? So 2 years is a very short lease in terms of commercial office space. So even if it's 5+ years, these leases are just starting to come up. And also a lot of companies have been afraid to downsize or move because they were still trying to figure out what was going to happen after COVID. Now, every company has a totally different policy, and every individual has a different need or desire to come back to the office or not. It's amazing. Everyone is so different. But what is very clear is that it is going to reduce the amount of commercial office space that we need.
We've only got a few seconds left with you. The name of your company, Omgivning. Can you tell me what it actually means in its native language?
It's a Swedish word, which is supposedly easier to say than my last name, which is debatable. But the Swedish word means the way a space feels around you. Because I think when we do architecture, really it all comes down to the space that we inhabit as human beings and what does that feel like.
That's fascinating stuff. Karin Liljegren, thank you so much for making the time to chat with us.
Thank you, Alex.